This lecture is prepared for the PLM Raha ROTC unit. Good day, cadets. In this video, I will be presenting about the rule of law. Before the discussion, let me introduce myself. I am First Lieutenant Jose Carriaga, Reserve Philippine Army. I am a member of the 105th Task Group, 1st Task Brigade, Reserve NCR, under the AFP Reserve Command, a BS Mechanical Engineering graduate, and work at the Department of Engineering and Public Works, City of Manila. After this presentation, you are expected to know the mechanism, process, institution, practice or norm that supports the equality of all citizens before the law, secures a non-arbitrary form of government, and more generally prevents the arbitrary use of power. Also to learn what it means to respect the rule of law and consider its importance in democracy. The following will be the flow of the discussion: an introduction and details on rule of law, then an overview on the Bill of Rights and habeas corpus, followed by the human rights and international humanitarian law. In 1945, the United Nations was created on three pillars: the international peace and security, human rights, and development. Years later, the complex political, social, and economic transformation of modern society has brought us challenges and opportunities, which require a collective response and guided by foundation of friendly and equitable relations between states and the base of fair societies, the rule of law. The rule of law, as formally defined by the United Nations, is a principle of governance in which all persons, institutions, and entities, public and private, including the state itself, are accountable to laws that are publicly promulgated, equally enforced, and independently adjudicated, and which are consistent with international human rights, norms, and standards. It requires measures to ensure adherence to the principles of supremacy of the law, equality before the law, accountability to the law, fairness in the application of the law, separation of powers, participation in decision-making, legal certainty, avoidance of arbitrariness, and procedural and legal transparency. The rule of law is fundamental to international peace and security and political stability, to achieve economic and social progress and development, and to protect people's rights and humanitarian freedoms. It is foundational to people's access to public services, curbing corruption, restraining the abuse of power, and to establishing the social contract between people and the state. In the Philippines, the Department of Justice introduced the rule of law framework that includes the following: Constitution or its equivalent as the highest law of the land, a clear and consistent legal frameworks and implementation thereof, strong institutions of justice, governance, security, and human rights that are well structured, financed, trained, and equipped, transitional justice processes and mechanisms, a public and civil society that contributes to strengthening the rule of law and holding public officials and institutions accountable. Laws are enforced equally and impartially. No one is above the law, and everyone under the authority of the Constitution is obligated equally to obey the law. Laws are obeyed and enforced according to established procedures, not the ruler's arbitrary will. Who enforces the rule of law? The courts and the human rights commissions are entrusted with the protection of the rights of individuals as well as the exercise of holding the government and its officials accountable for any violation thereof. Most simply put, it means that laws apply equally to everyone in a democracy, even the most powerful government officials and elected leaders. It also means that laws are created through a predetermined, open, and transparent process, not by the whim of the most powerful members of society. The Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights is sometimes called the Declaration of Rights or a Charter of Rights. It is a list of the most important rights to the citizens of a country. It establishes the relationship of the individual to the state and defines the rights of the individual by limiting the lawful power of the state. The Bill of Rights of the Philippines is embodied in Article 3 of the 1987 Philippine Constitution. Article 3 enumerates specific protections against the abuse of state power, most of which are similar to the provision of the United States Constitution. Some essential provisions are a right to due process and equal protection of law, a right against searches and seizures without a warrant issued by a judge, a right to privacy, the right to freedom of speech and expression, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and the right to petition, the free exercise of religion, a right of abode and the right to travel, a right to information on matters of public concern, and many more. Similar to U.S. jurisprudence and other common law jurisdictions, the scope and limitations of these rights have largely been determined by the Supreme Court through case law. The Article 3 of the 1987 Philippine Constitution has 22 sections of listing the Bill of Rights. Habeas corpus comes from a Latin which means you shall have the body. It is to inquire on the legality of the detention of a person. It is a writ or order requiring that a prisoner be brought before a judge or into court to decide whether he is being held lawfully. In the Bill of Rights in the Philippine Constitution, it is stated in Article 3, Section 15 that the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended except in cases of invasion or rebellion when the public safety requires it. There were some cases in our history where the writ of habeas corpus was suspended. In 1971, after the Plaza Miranda bombing, the Marcos administration under Ferdinand Marcos suspended habeas corpus in an effort to stifle the oncoming insurgency, having blamed the Filipino Communist Party for the events of August 21. Many consider this to be a prelude to martial law. After widespread protest, however, the Marcos administration decided to reintroduce the writ. Another one was in December 2009 under Arroyo administration. Habeas corpus was suspended in Maguindanao as the province was placed under martial law. This occurred in response to the Maguindanao massacre. I would like to share this video that will give us an overview on universal human rights.
The idea of human rights is that each one of us, no matter who we are or where we are born, is entitled to the same basic rights and freedoms. Human rights are not privileges, and they cannot be granted or revoked. They are inalienable and universal. That may sound straightforward enough, but it gets incredibly complicated as soon as anyone tries to put the idea into practice. What exactly are the basic human rights? Who gets to pick them? Who enforces them, and how? The history behind the concept of human rights is a long one. Throughout the centuries and across societies, religions, and cultures, we have struggled with defining notions of rightfulness, justice, and rights. But one of the most modern affirmations of universal human rights emerged from the ruins of World War II with the creation of the United Nations. The treaty that established the UN gives as one of its purposes to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights. And with the same spirit, in 1948, the UN General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This document, written by an international committee chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt, lays the basis for modern international human rights law. The Declaration is based on the principle that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. It lists 30 articles recognizing, among other things, the principle of non-discrimination and the right to life and liberty. It refers to negative freedoms, like the freedom from torture or slavery, as well as positive freedoms, such as the freedom of movement and residence. It encompasses basic civil and political rights, such as freedom of expression, religion, or peaceful assembly, as well as social, economic, and cultural rights, such as the right to education and the right to freely choose one's occupation and be paid and treated fairly. The Declaration takes no sides as to which rights are more important, insisting on their universality, indivisibility, and interdependence. And in the past decades, international human rights law has grown, deepening and expanding our understanding of what human rights are and how to better protect them. So if these principles are so well developed, then why are human rights abused and ignored time and time again all over the world? The problem, in general, is that it is not at all easy to universally enforce these rights or to punish transgressors. The UDHR itself, despite being highly authoritative and respected, is a declaration, not a hard law. So when individual countries violate it, the mechanisms to address those violations are weak. For example, the main bodies within the UN in charge of protecting human rights mostly monitor and investigate violations, but they cannot force states to, say, change a policy or compensate a victim. That's why some critics say it's naive to consider human rights a given in a world where state interests wield so much power. Critics also question the universality of human rights and emphasize that their development has been heavily guided by a small number of mostly Western nations, to the detriment of inclusiveness. The result? A general bias in favor of civil political liberties over socio-political rights, and of individual over collective or groups' rights. Others defend universal human rights laws and point at the positive role they have on setting international standards and helping activists in their campaigns. They also point out that not all international human rights instruments are powerless. For example, the European Convention on Human Rights establishes a court where the 47 member countries and their citizens can bring cases. The court issues binding decisions that each member state must comply with. Human rights law is constantly evolving, as are our views and definitions of what the basic human rights should be. For example, how basic or important is the right to democracy or to development? And as our lives are increasingly digital, should there be a right to access the internet? A right to digital privacy? What do you think?
As the video explained, we are humans and we have our rights simply because we exist as human beings. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights has 30 articles stating that different human rights that we have regardless of race, sex, nationality, ethnicity, language, religion, or status. For example,
if you're looking for a washroom, there should be one you feel safe using. If you're trying to get medical help, you should be able to make it inside of the doctor's office. If you're interviewing for a job, you shouldn't be rejected because you're pregnant. And if you're looking to rent a home, you shouldn't be turned down because of your race.
It is important to make sure that we know our rights, because these rights will ensure that our basic needs are met, that each of one of us have access to medicine, food and water, clothes and shelter as a baseline level of dignity. These rights also protect us, especially those vulnerable groups like persons with disabilities and senior citizens, from abuse. It empowers people to stand up to societal corruption and that they deserve dignity. Also, it encourages freedom of speech and expression, that no one should feel in danger because of what they think. Being able to choose who to love is an essential part of human rights. Access to education and equal work opportunities are also included in the rights. How anyone have access to proper education, even the poor and not just the elites? How we should be equally treated in our work area and flourish in the society. As humans are protected, also the environment, the place we live in, with protected and clean air, water, and soil. And lastly, with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it provides guidelines and standards where government can be held accountable for. As a final note, we must support member states in strengthening the rule of law with coherent assistance and ensure that the rule of law finds its place for peace and security, for the future international development agenda, and for the work for respect of human rights. Anyone who holds that what matters most in politics is having the right people in power and not how power should be constrained will be unconvinced of the value of the rule of law. We all do have rights, but we also have responsibilities. We have to respect the rights of others, to recognize discrimination, to speak out against injustice, and to preserve dignity, respect, and the beauty of human experience. That is the end of our discussion. Remember, no one is above the law. Thank you.